So, just a brief comment on this third pair of essays on the ethics of gun ownership. First by Humor, Is There a Right to Own a Gun? And I think the second by DeGrazia is called The Ethics of American Handgun Ownership. Well, I think that the key to this discussion, although the vocabulary may change slightly between essays, has to do with rights, different sorts of rights that human beings can be said to possess, and the conditions under which those rights can be said to either be overridden or, to use the terminology of DeGrazia, defeated. Really, DeGrazia's question is there an undefeated moral right to own a handgun? And I think that his discussion more or less follows the same basic structure as Humor's, and that is that rights are of different sorts. Some are fundamental, some are derivative. Maybe there are some absolute rights, though I think that Humor says that there probably aren't. But there are at least prima facie rights on the face of it. And on the face of it, it would seem that you do have a right to own a gun if you derive pleasure or for whatever reason you want. The question is there an overriding interest on the part of others because of either the harm that your ownership of a gun might do, or because your right to own a gun may conflict with other rights that other people have, prevent them from enjoying their rights. Unfortunately, I don't think that there is really a kind of a fundamental argument on either side that's easy to characterize. I think both recognize that the argument for owning a gun, or for the right to own a gun, or that it's moral to own a gun, can be thought of in two ways. One, just basic liberty rights. I have the right to do whatever the heck I want on the face of it. But if my exercise of that right, that freedom, one might say, that liberty right to do whatever the heck I want, it very quickly runs into problems if I exercise my liberties in certain ways. That is, if it turns out that my exercise of my liberty rights causes harm to others, or conflicts with other people's rights, then my liberty rights can be constrained if an argument can be made that such harms that result from me exercising those rights outweigh my right, or if other people's rights are being violated through my exercise of my liberty right. The other sort of right that we're talking about here is perhaps both take more seriously, and that is the notion that the right to own a gun is connected up with is derivative of the right to self-defense, which would ultimately be the right to life. Every human being presumably has a right to life, and therefore has a right to defend that life, and therefore it would seem has a right to those things which are necessary in order to defend that right. Both take that seriously, I believe, and the most striking thing that Humor writes is his scenarios in which he compares banning handguns or preventing people from owning handguns to situations in which one human being prevents another from defending him or herself from an attacker, literally holding someone down while they're attacked. We would consider that to be a violation of that person's right to self-defense. The question is, well, as we saw in the case, let's say, of Thompson, whether that analogy really is sound. That is preventing somebody from owning a handgun. Is it comparable to holding someone down while they're attacked? Or in another one of the scenarios, is it comparable to tying people up and leaving them out in the wilderness, not knowing which one is going to be eaten by a wolf? That's really for you to decide, but it would seem to be a very strong argument if indeed it is a good analogy, that is it the case that preventing somebody from owning a handgun for the purposes of self-defense is comparable to those other fanciful situations? It really comes down to, if you look in the De Grazia, towards the end of the De Grazia article, he lays out the case for the moral right to own a handgun. And the crucial step there, and the one I think he spends the most time on, is whether or not a handgun is actually a requirement to defend oneself adequately. That is, we have a right to self-defense, so seemingly we have a right to what we would need to exercise the right to self-defense. And the question is an empirical one. That is, in the current sort of society, I suppose American society especially, that we live in, is it a requirement in order to defend oneself adequately to have a handgun in the home? And this is what he restricts himself to, De Grazia. That becomes an empirical question. And one of the things that he's, I think, very good at, one of the things he says, which I think is quite good, is that the question is not whether there are any people who do need a gun to defend themselves. The question is whether it is a reasonable thing, whether it's a required thing in general. You don't have to prove that. If there's one person who does legitimately need a gun to defend themselves, it does not necessarily mean that we should make handguns legal for everyone. So it becomes an empirical question, and I think that's something you really have to think about, is whether or not, in general, it's a reasonable demand that we be allowed to have a gun to defend ourselves. Humer thinks that it is, obviously. De Grazia pretty much says no. That is that the handgun ownership, again, using slightly different form of the language, but is actually self-defeating because from the evidence that he gives, even though a handgun may in some cases be something necessary in order to defend oneself in certain situations, the presence of a handgun in a household makes everyone less safe on average. That is, if you buy a handgun and you keep it in your house, you're much more likely to be harmed by it, or somebody in the house be harmed by it, than to use it successfully in self-defense or in case of a burglar or something like that. So the question of the ethics of handgun ownership, I think one thing that's common to both essays is that we talk of it in terms of rights, and we talk of it in terms of what needs to be the case in order to override or defeat someone's rights.